She was 43 years old. She was a librarian. On the morning of March 9, 1970, she drove to work the same way she had driven to work for 11 years, parked in the same spot behind the Harlan County Public Library in Harlan, Kentucky, unlocked the back door at 8:45, and was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is a story about a man who knew exactly where she would be, and exactly when, and who had been inside that building before. And it would take 54 years, a county evidence audit that nobody requested, and a cold case detective who almost put the file back in the cabinet, and a single button that had been sitting in a sealed evidence bag since the spring of 1970, to finally do what could have been done decades earlier. Because the man who killed Dorothy Jean Calmes was already in the National Criminal Database when investigators finally ran the button. He had been there for 31 years. He had been there findable, with his name attached, while Dorothy's family buried a mother and a sister and a brother without ever knowing who had taken her from them. But before we can talk about the button, or the database, or the 31 years it sat waiting, we have to go back to Harlan. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Dorothy was. Harlan, Kentucky in the winter of 1970 was a coal town working its way through a long transition. The mines that had defined the county for 3 generations were still running, but the mechanization that had been creeping in through the 1960s had changed the arithmetic of who worked and who didn't, and the town carried the particular tension of a place that knows what it was and isn't certain what it's becoming. Downtown Harlan had a 5 and dime, a Western Auto, 2 movie theaters that showed pictures on alternating weeks, a courthouse that had stood since 1917, and the public library on Central Street, a modest brick building with 6 wooden reading tables, a circulation desk worn smooth along the front edge from 1,000 elbows resting there, and roughly 14,000 volumes. Many of them donated by families who had found, somewhere in the coal and tension years, that books were the one thing that traveled light. Dorothy Calmes had been the head librarian since 1959. She knew every volume, which was not a figure of speech. She had catalogued them personally, twice. She knew which books children returned with the spines cracked from being held too tight, which was her method of identifying a child who had needed a story badly enough to take it to bed. She kept a list of those children, and she made sure they always had something to take home. Dorothy was 43 years old in March of 1970 and had never married, which in Harlan in 1970 was a circumstance that other people felt free to comment on, and that Dorothy herself appeared entirely unbothered by. She lived alone in a house on Ivy Street, 3 rooms, a garden in the back that she worked in the spring and summer, with the focused pleasure of someone whose other pleasures were largely internal. She was the middle child of 5. Her parents were still living. Her older sister Ruth lived 8 miles away. Her younger brother Calvin was working the mines and had 3 children whose names Dorothy could recite along with their birthdays and their favorite books. She had a habit that her sister Ruth described in later years as the most Dorothy thing imaginable. She kept a running list, in a small leather notebook she carried in her coat pocket, of books she intended to recommend to specific people. Not books she had read and liked, books she had read and thought of someone specific while reading. The notebook was not at her desk when investigators arrived. It was not in the library at all. It was never found. That notebook and what it contained has been a particular grief to her family for 54 years. The sense of all those undelivered recommendations, all those thoughts she had been saving for people she cared about, gone without arriving. The morning of March 9th, 1970 unfolded with the kind of ordinary precision that makes the interruption of it so hard to absorb afterward. Dorothy arrived at 8:45, as noted by the building's maintenance supervisor, a man named Earl Pratt, who was salting the back steps when she pulled in. He waved. She waved. He went inside ahead of her and left through the front. The library did not open to the public until 9:30. Dorothy had 45 minutes alone in the building, which she used the same way she always used it. Reshelving, reviewing the day's holds, setting out the children's storytime chairs for the Thursday afternoon program 2 days away. The first patron of the day, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Aldridge, who arrived at 9:28 every morning and spent the first hour in the periodicals room with the Louisville Courier-Journal, found the front door unlocked and the circulation desk empty, and called out for Dorothy twice before going to the telephone on the desk and calling the police. It was 9:31 a.m. Between 8:45 and 9:31, something had happened in that building. No one heard it. No one saw it. The back door, through which Dorothy had entered, was found standing open when deputies arrived. At 9:47, a deputy found Dorothy in the small storage room at the rear of the library, behind the shelving unit that held the periodical back issues. She was taken by ambulance to Harlan Community Hospital. She died at 11:12 a.m. without regaining consciousness. She was 43 years old. The library's back door opened onto an alley. The alley ran between Central Street and a service lane behind the hardware store on the next block. Anyone who knew the building, its layout, its schedule, its habits, could have entered that alley and that back door in the 45 minutes before the public arrived. Earl Pratt had been on the front steps. Nobody had been watching the back. The Harlan County Sheriff's Department took the lead on the investigation. The detective assigned was a man named Deputy Sheriff Frank Lederer, a 32-year-old who had joined the department in 1963 and who brought to this case the particular determination that comes from investigating a crime against someone the whole town loved. He processed the storage room. He interviewed every person who had been near the library that morning. He examined the back alley with the systematic attention of someone who understood that whatever had been left behind would be small. What he found, documented in the original case file, a file that would grow to 212 pages across the active investigation and then stop, included a partial shoe impression in the alley mud, too degraded for a useful cast, a smear on the back door frame that suggested the door had been held from the outside, and, from the floor of the storage room, a button. A single button, dark brown, 4-hole, approximately 3/4 of an inch in diameter, with a slight convex face. It did not match anything Dorothy was wearing that morning. It did not match the library staff's uniforms or standard issue. It was bagged, labeled, and placed in the evidence log as Item 7. It remained Item 7 for 54 years. Lederer developed 3 persons of interest in the first 2 months. The strongest focus fell on a man named Roy Sizemore, a 38-year-old who had been let go from a maintenance position at the library in 1968, following a dispute over hours, and who had, according to 2 separate accounts, made comments about Dorothy that her colleagues had found unsettling at the time and mentioned only now that they had reason to. Sizemore was interviewed 4 times across the spring of 1970. He had an alibi for the morning of March 9th. He had been at the county employment office, where a clerk remembered him, and while Lederer found the alibi convenient in its specificity, he could not shake it. The clerk was certain. Sizemore was eliminated as a formal suspect in June of 1970, a conclusion that Lederer accepted and then spent years afterward reopening in his mind and closing again because nothing changed. The shoe impression was too degraded. The door smear was unprocessable with the technology available. The button was Item 7 in a sealed bag, and Dorothy's family went on living without knowing who had taken her from them. Ruth Combs, Dorothy's older sister, was 47 in 1970 and would live to be 91. She spent 44 of those years asking the Harlan County Sheriff's Department for updates. She was polite and persistent in the way of someone who had grown up understanding that the powerful would not yield to anger, but might, given enough time and enough presence, yield to something quieter. She called every 6 months. She wrote every year on the anniversary of Dorothy's death. She drove to the library on March 9th every year and stood outside for a few minutes and then went home. She had outlived her parents, her other siblings, and most of the people who remembered Dorothy as a living person rather than as a story. She told her granddaughter, in the last years of her life, that the thing she could not release was not the grief, she said, you learn to carry, but the not knowing. Not knowing was a different weight. It moved differently. It never found its place in you the way grief did. It just kept moving. By 2000, 30 years had passed. The Harlan County Sheriff's Department had turned over its leadership 3 times. Frank Lederer had retired in 1988 and died in 2003. The 212-page case file had been moved from the active cabinet to the archive room to the evidence storage building behind the department's main office. The button, item 7, was still in its bag, in a box with a case number on the end tab, in a row of similar boxes, in a room that the department's custodian described, in a 2024 interview with a local newspaper, as the room where things waited. Some things had waited a long time. Dorothy's file had been in that room since the early 1990s. Ruth still called every 6 months. She called in 2005 and was told there was nothing new. She called in 2007. Nothing new. She called in 2009 for the last time, at 86 years old, and the detective who took her call noted it in the file and had nothing new to offer, and Ruth thanked him and hung up. She died in 2011. Her granddaughter found, in her things, 40 years of notes from telephone calls, dates, names of officers, what was said, what was not said, written in the same careful hand, filed in a manila folder marked simply Dorothy. If any record exists of what a family does with 40 years of unanswered questions, it is that folder. The case had been cold for 53 years when a detective named Sergeant Willa Croft decided to read it. Croft had joined the Harlan County Sheriff's Department in 2010 and had been assigned to the department's Cold Case Review Project, a one-person operation, part-time, that had been initiated in 2018 with a state grant and had reviewed 11 cases in 6 years. Dorothy Combs was the 12th. Croft pulled the file in the fall of 2023 as part of a systematic evidence audit that the department had undertaken after a state directive requiring all counties to inventory pre-1990 evidence holdings. She was not expecting anything that the 11 previous reviews had not already yielded. She opened the file, read the 212 pages over 3 evenings at her kitchen table, and found the entry for item 7. She went to the evidence storage building the next morning. The box was on the 3rd shelf from the floor. Item 7 was still in its bag. The button was still inside. She held it up to the light. Dark brown. 4-hole. Slight convex face. She read the description in the 1970 evidence log. She read the line that said it did not match anything the victim had been wearing. And she thought about what the last 20 years of forensic science had made possible. And she thought about the state's Cold Case DINA initiative, which offered free processing for evidence items from unsolved pre-2000 homicides. And she signed the submission form that afternoon. 3 months later, On a Tuesday morning in January of 2024, Croft was at her desk when the results arrived by secure email from the Kentucky State Police Forensic Lab. She opened them. She read the name attached to the Dina profile recovered from the button. She read it again. She typed the name into the law enforcement database. The profile had matched an entry in the National Combined Dina Index System, an entry that had been there since 1993, when the man to whom it belonged had been convicted of a felony assault in neighboring Bell County, Kentucky, and his Dina collected as part of standard processing. He had been in the system for 31 years. 31 years in the database, while Dorothy's case sat in a box 3 counties away. Croft set down her coffee. She picked up her phone. She called her supervisor. "I need you to come look at something," she said. His name was Walter Brock. He was 82 years old in January of 2024, and he was living in a retirement community in Middlesboro, Kentucky, 26 miles from Harlan. He had grown up in Harlan County. He had been 28 years old in March of 1970. Records confirmed that he had been a patron of the Harlan County Public Library. His card was in the library's own archived borrowing records, recovered and reviewed as part of the 2024 investigation, and that he had checked out materials on at least 9 occasions between 1967 and 1970. He knew the building. He knew its hours. He had been inside. In 1993, he had been convicted of felony assault in Bell County, served 18 months, and been released. He had lived quietly in the region for the following 30 years, aging into the kind of retired man whom neighbors describe, when asked, as keeping to himself. He had never returned to Harlan for any documented reason. He had never been interviewed in connection with Dorothy's case. His name had never appeared in the 212 pages. He had simply continued, for 54 years, while the button sat in its bag on the 3rd shelf from the floor. He was arrested at the retirement community on a Wednesday morning in February of 2024. 2 deputies and Sergeant Croft made the approach. Walter Brock was in the common room when they arrived, at a table near the window. He saw them cross the lobby. He watched them walk toward him. When Croft introduced herself and told him why they were there, he did not speak. He did not ask questions. He stood when they asked him to stand. He was read his rights in the common room of a retirement facility, in front of the morning staff and 2 other residents who happened to be present, and he looked at the floor and said nothing and allowed himself to be led out. He was 82 years old. He had been living 26 miles from the place where he had killed Dorothy John Combs for 54 years. At trial in Harlan County in November of 2024, the prosecution presented the Dina evidence, the library borrowing records establishing his familiarity with the building, and testimony from 2 elderly witnesses, both in their 80s. Both reached through painstaking records work by Croft's team, who remembered from 1970 having seen a man matching Brock's description in the alley behind the library on the morning of March 9th. They had been teenagers at the time. They had not thought to come forward because no one had asked them directly. The defense argued the Dina was ambiguous, that the button's chain of custody across 54 years raised evidentiary questions, that the witness memories were too old to be reliable. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They returned a guilty verdict on the charge of murder in the 1st degree. Walter Brock was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole in December of 2024. He was escorted from the courtroom in a wheelchair. He has made no public statement. Dorothy Combs's granddaughter, the daughter of Dorothy's younger brother Calvin, a woman named Patricia who had grown up hearing the story of the aunt she never knew, stood on the courthouse steps in Harlan after the verdict and spoke to a small gathering of reporters and family members. She had Ruth's manila folder in her hands. She held it up not dramatically, just held it, so that the reporters could see what it was. "This is 40 years of phone calls," she said. "My great-aunt Ruth made these calls for 40 years. She did not say anything else about it. She did not need to." Dorothy Jean Calms knew which children took books to bed. She saved recommendations in a leather notebook for people she had thought of while reading. Recommendations that never arrived. She catalogued 14,000 volumes because she believed that knowing where every book was meant that no one who needed one would have to leave without it. She was 43 years old. She unlocked the back door at 8:45 on a March morning and did not come out again. And a man she recognized from the borrowing desk walked in behind her and changed everything, and then went back to his life 26 miles away and kept it for 54 years. A button the size of a thumbnail, sitting in a bag on a shelf, ended it. Not the investigation of 1970, not the 30 subsequent years of phone calls, but a one-person cold case audit in 2023, and a detective who decided to read all 212 pages. The button was always there. The database was there for 31 of those years. The distance between the button and the database was a signed submission form and 3 months of waiting. That is what 54 years of silence actually cost. What does it mean that the Dina system had his name for 31 years and nobody connected it to a sealed bag in an evidence room 3 counties away? Should counties be required to run all pre-2000 biological evidence against the national database on a regular basis? And if not, why not? And what do you do with Ruth's folder, 40 years of phone calls written down in careful handwriting, filed under a single name? When you think about what it represents, and what it would have meant to her to hear what Patricia heard on those courthouse steps. Justice came for Dorothy Combs after 54 years. It came because someone decided the file was worth reading all the way through and the button was worth submitting. That is both the comfort and the outrage of this case, held in the same hand at the same time. If you believe that cold cases deserve exactly that kind of attention, patient, thorough, all 212 pages, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. More are waiting in the description. Thank you for being here.